After the diagnosis, but before the treatment plan. After the death, but before the funeral planning begins. After getting fired, before going home to tell our family. After the phone call, but before sharing the news. That time in between. That's where the disciples were stuck. And in that sense, we can understand their fear and the grief. The fear is always the easiest one to understand. It's something we all struggle with. We understand about the struggle and the doubt. We are incredulous when we are full of fear. It makes sense to us. The disbelief, it's easy. And Jesus responds in ways that he knows they need. He knows what they needed. He responds exactly with what they need. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. It's how we started our worship service today. It's a greeting, a beginning, a connection. It's why we stand and welcome each other, passing the peace of Christ each week. Peace, because the resurrected are scary at first. Peace, I'm not a ghost. Peace, touch my hands, see my wounds. Let me eat that fish. Such a kind of strange comment. It's broiled fish, not baked fish, if you were particular about that. But once he's got the formalities out of the way, he begins to teach again. But can you imagine? No wonder the disciples never understood anything that Jesus told them. If he spent all that time teaching the hard stuff right after the miraculous. Think back to those moments we talked about, those fear and pain and grief that we talked about. Nobody's brain is working right at that moment. You know, it's like trying to think through molasses, trying to think in the midst of grief. It's slow to comprehend the easy stuff, like eating another meal. And the disciples, Jesus doesn't slow down for them. Okay, disciples, keep up. I told you I was going to die. I told you I'd be back. You should be ready for this. I need you to get past this and get to work. There's so much work to do. Go and tell all the nations. Go, the whole world needs to know. Tell them of repentance. Tell them of forgiveness. Start in Jerusalem and go into the rest of the world. Also, for those of you who were really worried or wondering about this, I looked it up this week, that somewhere in the South Pacific is actually at the opposite end of the world of Jerusalem. So we're nowhere near the opposite end of the world of Jerusalem. But we are still pretty far from Jerusalem, so we know that they did get to work. He told them, go into the rest of the world and tell them of God's love, of God's grace. You are the witnesses of these things. Go and speak, and I'll send you help. He's talking about the Holy Spirit to come on Pentecost. Over and over again, Jesus wanted the disciples to know that they had work to do. They must continue that work, but it didn't have to be alone. That fear and loneliness of grief isn't necessary because God is with them. And Thomas's story, it's so similar to the way the other disciples, with just a week in between. We like to call him Doubting Thomas as if he were the only one who didn't believe. But Luke shows that nobody really believed until meeting Jesus. And Thomas just got his own story so that we could connect to him. And Thomas' story is so similar. Jesus shows up in the midst of unbelief. They're stuck inside. It's impossible. And peace be with you. The peace of Christ be with you. What a blessing. In the midst of all that doubt, that fear, that grief, that anxiety, Christ's blessing of peace. I hear in these words the God of the Old Testament speaking in the still small voice following the storm. I hear in these words Christ telling the storm to calm. I think of those moments in my life when I have felt God's peace, when music has connected me to God in worship, when I have been sitting on a mountain myself and seen God in creation. Peace. Peace. Peace despite doubt. Peace despite fear. Peace despite it all. Because the disciples' doubts are all of us and all of our doubts. And the disciples' fears are all of us and all of our fears. How often does doubt creep into our faith? Or more likely take over our faith? Let's talk about doubt. Doubt is when we question, we dig, when we're uncertain about the reality of all. And if you've been paying attention, I'll always say that questions are good. Questions help us to grow and to challenge. Last week, someone asked me how I got started with all of this, and it was talking about how I got started to become a pastor. And in many ways, it started on a specific day of youth group when my pastor handed us a bunch of commentaries and a bunch of Bibles and a bunch of other books and said, figure it out. I still remember getting through youth group and going to school the next day and sitting in study hall with my friend from youth group, and both of us sitting there staring at each other going, well, my head kind of hurts, but I have more questions. She's also a pastor now. The questions, they didn't lead to doubt, but to more questions and stronger faith as I realized that God could handle my questions. And that's a moment in the life of faith that's hard to transition. Just as God can handle our anger, our grief, our fear, our struggles, God can handle our doubt. God can handle our questions. This is not some petty God who kicks us out if we have a question. This is the God who created the universe. This God can handle a few questions. The story of Thomas and the disciples and their doubt and Christ's own response to it tells us that God can handle our questions no matter what. Because Christ didn't expect them to believe immediately. Christ doesn't expect us to have faith that checks our brains or our emotions at the door. Christ expects us to use our doubt and our fears and our struggles and dig deeper. In fact, Christ would probably have preferred if the disciples had asked a few more questions back before the crucifixion so we wouldn't have to keep explaining it again and again. This last Wednesday at youth group, the youth began to ask questions about eternity and death and life and resurrection. Great questions that I didn't really have the answers to in some ways, and yet their faith is not lost in these questions, but strengthened in it. And my faith is strengthened as I understand that I don't have all the answers. Questions in our house, I asked the kids if they asked questions, and they all just kind of stared at me, but their parents started nodding, and I could see the word forming. Why? Why? Questions in our house get a bit frustrating, we'll say. Why? What's that? Who's that? What's happening? But my preschooler's questions aren't about doubting that I'm right. To him, I'm still always right. We'll get a little farther before that changes. But each question is about figuring out more details and more answers and probably more questions. I think the more I answer questions, the more he finds. But we haven't quite gotten to the point where he doesn't start to believe me. When he hears it, he wants to figure out how that connects to something else. We haven't had a lot of response in my call for questions for our summer sermon series. And I wonder if it's because anyone thinks their questions are unworthy. If they've been wondering something about who God is or what we do about God in ways that are kind of intimidating or kind of scary. I hope that we can all ask those questions, and I hope that you are writing down your questions. Or maybe everybody's just got it all figured out and I'm the only one with questions. If that's the case, let me know. We'll have you up here. This reminds me, though, of Paul's words. When I was a child, I had faith like a child, and now that I'm grown, so must my faith. As we grow into the wider world, we understand that faith is a choice. In the United Methodist Church, confirmation is our kind of rite of passage from childhood faith to adult faith. In confirmation, every time I give the youth a choice to say no. After the end of the year, they have to choose whether or not they will stand up and accept that faith, because they must figure out what they believe and what they don't believe and make that choice for faith. There has to be a time, there is a time in the life of every follower of Jesus when we must choose God. When someone joins the church, they must declare their faith publicly. If someone moves from one church to another and they've been a Christian their whole lives, they still have to stand up and say, I believe in Jesus. If you've never done that, give me a call. We'll have a conversation. But faith and doubt, they go hand in hand. If we never doubt or never acknowledge our doubt, we never dig deeper. Look at Thomas's encounter. He's speaking with the disciples, and his doubt is strong, and they're speaking of their own encounter. And of course, when the rest of the disciples are telling Thomas about it, I doubt that there we go, doubting again. I have a feeling that they didn't say, and we didn't believe him until he, ate the fish. And he's incredulous. Sure, guys, Jesus who was dead, who we buried, who we put in a tomb, he's just walking around eating fish. I believe you. Of course I do. And then Jesus appears. The fear probably instantly spiked. Instantly got even worse. And again, Jesus' response, peace be with you. Peace, Thomas, do not be afraid. Peace, Thomas, I'm here. Peace, Thomas, see my wounds, touch my side, I am here. Peace. And much like Mary Magdalene in the garden when she hears her name, Thomas's response, my Lord and my God. Immediate recognition, immediate response, immediate belief. I now understand my Lord and my God. That peace had sunken in, and nothing is holding him back at this point. Peace, because you believe. You have touched and seen, and you have believed. Thomas' faith is deepened by the questioning and the affirmation. Our faith is deepened by the questioning and the digging in, because as Jesus said to Thomas, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We don't get the chance to touch and feel. And I often wonder, when it comes to doubt, if many Christians believe that we have to fully understand everything and believe every detail in order to be a true Christian. But in fact, it's about trusting God through the doubt. I don't understand everything, and at times that makes me uncomfortable. But faith steps in when I choose to believe and choose to trust God despite the discomfort, despite the doubt. Because Jesus isn't physically here offering his pierced hands for us to touch, but Christ is here. God is here. The Spirit is here, calling peace into our questioning hearts. And our response must be to choose to believe.